All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Coffee and Quality's May quarterly virtual session. Our session topic is or generative AI for qualitative analysis. We are so excited to deep dive in. But first, let's go ahead and get some of our housekeeping out of the way. So, my name is Allison Mattingly, the Senior Quality Coach here at United Way of Greater Houston, and we're so happy to have you. Again, continue to warm up that chat. Use the chat freely for your questions and comments as we go along. That's going to be super helpful for us. So, as always, we want to ground ourselves in the space. Please feel free to share, ask your questions. It is an invitation, not an obligation, but we're all here to learn. And I'm excited to share this space with you guys today and our wonderful presenters. If you are not a part of our Teams channel and you would like to be, this is a space where we update regularly resources, have conversations, ask questions. Please drop your email in the chat so that we can record that and get you added to that Teams channel today. Just if folks that are in it share every Wednesday, we have resources posted on What Works Wednesday, and then it's just a great community to be a part of. All righty. Well, let's get right into it because we have so much to cover today. So I'm so excited. We have two guest speakers today with us, and I just want to introduce them before I turn the reins over to them. So first, we have Autumn Horne. Autumn is a senior research analyst at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research and a freelance data communication consultant. In her research, Autumn partners with school districts on projects that promote more positive and equitable outcomes for students and families. Autumn received her PhD in psychological sciences from Rice University. And then we also have Emily Castillo. Emily is a postdoctoral research associate at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. Over the past few years, she has worked on a multi-district RPP studying the impacts of ethnic studies on student success and reducing racial disparities. Her research takes an intersectional approach and is informed by Black and Chicana feminist theories with a focus on employing and advocating for Indigenous methods and methodologies in sociological research. Her dissertation work focused on the ways that grassroots educational justice organizers mobilize to resist whiteness in radicalized organizations such as school districts. So, Coffee and Quality is delighted to have these folks. They're going to take over the reins. So, I'm going to stop sharing and take it away, Autumn and Emily.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see some of you again. The last time I was here, we were working on generative AI to support quantitative analysis. And as you may have picked up from those bios, I am first and foremost a quantitative researcher. And so that is like my background and where I'm coming at this from, which is why I was super excited to partner with Emily, my co-presenter, who I think it's fair to say is first and foremost a really talented qualitative scholar. So you're going to be hearing from both of us kind of interchangeably throughout the presentation. And just like we have different experiences and different views, and sometimes even different opinions on the best way to approach some of these issues, we know that you all do as well. So, as Allison said, please do make use of the chat. The one of us who's not talking is going to be keeping an eye on it to kind of pick up those questions, pick up those comments. And we really want to kind of co-create the learning together, right? Because, qualitative research, one of the most, the best parts about it is bringing our experiences and our backgrounds and to what we can learn from the data. So, to get us started in that kind of vein, in the chat, thank you so much for introducing yourselves. We'd love to also hear from some of you. What are some stories, feedback, or conversations that your organization is collecting, but that you're struggling to fully learn from? So, in other words, this is kind of a sneaky way of saying, what qualitative data do you have at your disposal that you feel like you're not taking advantage of? And while people are kind of populating the chat with their own kind of experiences, I can say one thing that our organization, so the Kinder Institute, Emily and I both work in the education research group at the Kinder Institute. And one piece of qualitative data that we have a lot of and like good access to that we struggle to fully learn from are school board meeting agendas and school board meeting minutes. This is something that Emily's done a lot of work on that you're going to hear her talk about kind of later on is how to learn from those documents. But for us, that was one of the ways that this like practically started becoming relevant, like where we started using AI to process really large volumes of information, like the qualitative information. Okay, so I'm seeing parent survey feedback. Megan, yes, survey feedback, another one, right? So those open-ended responses, especially if you have a lot of them, that's it can be a struggle for lots of reasons to pull out like the information that you know you could be getting there. Yeah, visitor feedback on their experience at the zoo. Thank you, Melissa. Ooh, site visit conversations, focus group transcripts, foster parent training evaluations. So we've got interviews, we've got focus groups, we've got documents, student employee daily logs. Okay, yeah, so archival or well, I don't know if that's archival, but yeah, documentation of how your program is running. Emily, what are you kind of seeing here?
Yeah, no, these are all great. I think I'm thinking about all of these. All of these are absolutely these are definitely forms of qualitative qualitative data collection that I think oftentimes, especially in the when you're in the midst of doing a lot of other work, especially like survey work, t can tend to get pushed to the side, but it gives you a lot of really rich information. So I think that all of these are really great examples.
Yeah, and this is a good place for us to say too that in the last two-thirds of this workshop, we're really just going to be digging in hands-on with a chat bot like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini. And we have example data for you in the event that, you don't want to use your own or you're not sure if you can use your own yet, or that. So you can use our examples, but feel free if you have, for example, client surveys or a selection of like a document with a bunch of free responses in it from a survey. Feel free to use those as your example when we're working through some of the prompts that Emily and I put together for these different kinds of qualitative data. So with that, I'll hand it over to Emily. She's going to start us off and talk about kind of our objectives for this workshop.
Thank you. Yeah, so just a brief overview of today's plan. I wanted to start off with just a really brief introduction to qualitative analysis and what that is and what that means, and some of the ways that we can dive into that in terms of the different methods and the different methodologies and things like that. So, and then Autumn's gonna focus a portion on generative AI tools and how to use that, and some really good tips and tricks for you to be able to get the best usage out of those tools, right? And then, of course, with anything technological, there's always ethical and security concerns. So we're going to kind of touch on those a little bit, and then we're going to hopefully with the examples and the tie back, we're going to link together the intersections where AI and qualitative meet, and where AI can really kind of support the work that qualitative researchers do. And so we'll be doing this we're going to give, if you brought your own data and want to do that, that's absolutely great. And we encourage you to do so. But if you didn't, we have a couple of examples here of surveys, focus groups, and documents that we'll share with you. And so just to get started, I really like to think about qualitative methods as answering the how and the why instead of the how many that you would normally get out of something like quantitative. And it gives you it sits on this idea that context and nuance matter in the course of a larger research study. And I really like this idea of the how and the why, and then the how many being part of quant, because if you're trying to get a holistic picture right, you want all of that. And so I think that there tends to oftentimes be a misconception that the two don't work with one another or that one is superior to the other. But I think that when we're doing research, we can get the most out of our data and the richest research if we're able to, kind of think about a mixed methods approach that combines the two. All right. And just a little about why you want to use qualitative methods, right? As I was saying, you want to gain a fuller understanding of unquantifiable information. And so this really means things like subjectivity, personal experiences, really kind of nuanced and contextual information that really matter and inform the research and inform a lot of the decisions that folks take or the ways that people, whatever your research project is. Um, we always want to see what all of the I guess like the surrounding material is that leads to those answers, right? And qualitative really kind of lets you dive into that in a much deeper way. It also provides deeper insights into real world problems, right? So like thinking about quantitative, we can do quantitative models that allow us to see, what the rate of like let's say racial disparities across education, for example, right? Or like the racial achievement gap. But if we're thinking about the qualitative methods and how we would use that, we would that's going to tell us like what the numbers are, and the qualitative is really going to let us drill down to like the reasons behind that, what the experiences of the students are, what the experiences of the teachers are, what the institutions are doing to alleviate that, right? So it gives you like kind of all of the surrounding context that you need for a holistic study. And so, like I was saying, it's easily combinable with quantitative methods. And so one of the ways that I think that I really, the example that I really like is when you go out to eat with somebody, right? Like you're taking somebody to a new restaurant in your city for the first time. And one of the first things we do is we go to Yelp, right? And we see what the reviews are. And so we're using quantitative data to let us know what the star rating is, and we want to see how many people rated it that, and if it's worth that rating, right? The more people or the more cases, and the bigger the N, the more that we tend to rely on the validity of that 4-star rating, right? But once you've decided on, once you've kind of picked that restaurant, you want to know why they gave it that, and so you go into the comments and you start reading and seeing like what are the best dishes, what are the best, what is the atmosphere like, what did people experience there, and so all of that information together gives you a well-rounded picture of what you can expect in that dining experience, right? And so I kind of like to think about the combination of the two in that way. I think it really, for me, it makes sense in my head to think about it because it's one of the most common ways that we use both types of data. So I hope that's helpful for folks. Um, and so just kind of going over two big ways of doing qualitative research. You have the inductive or the deductive approach to coding and analysis. And so an inductive approach is really bottom up and it's driven by the data. Oftentimes when you're doing inductive work, you really don't know what you have and you really want to see what it is that the data is telling you, right? Like you're not coming in necessarily with presuppositions. It might be the first time that you're researching this topic or that you're even looking at the data. Maybe it's the first time, for example, that you collected surveys about, zoo experience, feedback at the zoo, right? Like, and so you don't know what you're going to expect. So you're just kind of going from the bottom up. The deductive approach is a top-down, and it usually comes out of a theory and a hypothesis, right? So, for example, going back to that idea about the racial achievement gap, I could be using theory to really think about what my hypothesis is. Like, I believe that these are the reasons that we can see the racial achievement gap happening within the context of the programs that are in the school district. And so that really kind of informs some of the things that I'm looking for in the data. I'm looking maybe for the quality of education, the training of teachers, the student to teacher ratio, right? I've already kind of come up with some ideas based on the theory of what could be causing that, and those are the things that I'm trying to see if they're playing out in the data, right? Both of them are valid approaches, but they serve very different purposes, right? And so when you're thinking about using qualitative methods and doing qualitative analysis, you really want to ask yourself, what is the goal of the project, right? And I think oftentimes, and I really want to emphasize this with qualitative because I have found that throughout my graduate school and undergraduate experience, qualitative is probably one of the areas that we are least trained in. And so oftentimes, in mentoring students throughout the years, I always find students who are like, well, I'll do focus groups because, well, why do you want to do a focus group? Well, that's the one that I've been trained in. And it doesn't necessarily answer the question, right? So you really want to think about what the goal of the project is and taking that approach. And you might have different types of data that can answer those questions, right? But you really want to know what it is that you're trying to find out. So, and again, like I said, if you're just trying to see what it is that you don't know about this, and it's kind of like a first time thing, you're delving into it, the inductive approach is kind of the best way to start with that.
And I think this is a great transition point too, because I think Emily really nicely emphasizes the importance of foregrounding what is the goal of this project. And that is something that AI cannot decide for you, right? That's something that you, as the human researcher, are deciding from the beginning that's guiding the way the AI tools are going to work with you as a co-analyst. So I really want to foreground this point that AI is super powerful. Like these large language models, they're very powerful. They can be really useful co-analysts for you. They speed up things. They catch things you miss. They also make stuff up and like, lie and things like that too, right? But they can do all of the good stuff as well. But they're not a replacement for a human researcher. And so all of the information that I'm going to give you about these tools is really my approach in my own work with these tools is to like use the AI for what the AI is good at and keep Autumn in charge of what Autumn is good at. And you'll kind of see that reflected here. Okay, so the two main ways to use AI for qualitative analysis. The first is if you're doing qualitative analysis in more of like a researchy context, you might be using some sort of tool like MaxQDA or Deduce to like code documents if you're like doing kind of official qualitative research, right? And those tools have AI tools built into them now. That's kind of its own separate conversation, and Emily knows a lot about doing that. More so from my experience, and then what we're going to sort of design, what we designed all of our examples around are actually using AI chatbots. So large language model chatbots. For example, you've probably heard of them by their brand names, right? So like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, or Copilot are like the four big ones. You access just so we're all, we all make sure we're on the same like level playing field. You access them on the internet. So you go to these websites that are underneath each of these, like the names and logos of the chatbots. You go to the website. You can usually use them without making an account, but if you want to access most of the features and like have more extended conversations with these chatbots, you'll probably need a free account. So if you haven't already and you want to work through some of the examples with us, I would encourage you to go to ChatGPT is pretty low barrier to entry. Gemini is also pretty low barrier to entry. I mean, honestly, all of them are. If you want to go to one of these websites and like open up your account, if you already have one, or make a free account really quickly, you'll use that account and that chat interface to work through our examples later. And if you have any questions that come up, just drop them in the chat and we can try to troubleshoot with you a little bit when we take a pause to start working through examples. So if you're having trouble doing this, just note problems there, and Emily or and someone else can reply to you. So what are these large language models? What is ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini? What's it doing? So basically, these are chatbots that have been trained on massive amounts of text and information from the internet. They just like scrape a whole bunch of information from the internet, and that data set is getting like larger and larger and larger over time. And the large language model is looking for patterns in all of that data. And when you ask it a question, it responds to the question by trying to predict like the most likely response based on what it knows about the internet, right? Those like that large amount of text data that it got from the internet. So it's basically a prediction, it's a pattern recognition and prediction machine, right? It's not like a brain, like, and it's not thinking like we think exactly. So
Oh,
that
wait,
means it's
before,
go
sorry,
ahead.
I don't mean to interrupt.
No.
We had a question in the chat, and it was something I think we should cover.
Yes.
Um, so somebody mentioned that they're not allowed to use GPT or Claude because of HIPAA regulations.
Mhm.
We do want to stress that please check with your organization to see what tools they want you to use, and it may be that in some cases that they have actual partnerships or contracts with specific models. For example, right at Rice, if we use Gemini largely, and if we sign in through our Rice account to use Gemini, then all of the information that is uploaded, if we're using data or whatever within that, all of that is safe from being used to train the algorithms for the larger Gemini. So it's protected in that way. So please, if you don't know what your AI policy is at your job, like talk to your IT or whoever's in charge of that. Find out which is the model that they recommend or they prefer, that they have maybe even agreements with, so that you can have access to it for free. But yes, you always want to make sure that you are thinking about things like the HIPAA regulations, right? And just in general, I think the general rule of thumb is that if you're going to don't put anything into an AI model that you aren't comfortable sharing with a stranger through email.
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Caitlin, and for the explanation, Emily. That is super important. Um, and okay, so the way that these large language models work means that they're really good at some things and they're really bad at some things, right? So a pattern recognition and prediction machine is going to be really good at summarizing information, organizing large amounts of information, finding patterns, brainstorming with you, but it might not be the best at picking up on nuance. It is incapable of verifying the truth, right? It has no conception of what like a ground level truth is. It doesn't necessarily understand what is context for like it thinks it has a ton of context, so it doesn't necessarily know like what is the relevant context to apply to specific experiences or conversations. And of course, just like it can't verify truth, it can't make an ethical judgment. So just all things to keep in mind, because you'll see that we lean when we talk through the examples, we really lean on asking it to do what I think it's good at, right? And we keep all of the stuff that it's bad at to like our judgment as a researcher, as a human who's using this as a tool. Okay, so as you're chatting with these AI bots, right? ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, I just want to go over a few basic principles of prompting, which is like the official word for having a conversation with the machine. So effective interactions, that was supposed to say interactions. Effective interactions with AI contain similar ingredients. So the prompts contain like similar pieces, right? So you're going to be doing things like giving the model a task. So telling it what you want it to do, giving it context. That's like background about what you're asking it to do or how you collected the data. Another thing that people do often in these conversations is tell the AI to adopt a persona. Who do you want the model to act as? For example, you might want it to act as a program evaluator, for example, or a qualitative researcher. This can be a really useful tool, but just like so many other places in an interaction with an AI, this is also a place where you can introduce bias, right? Because if you tell it, you can introduce bias in a good way or maybe in a harmful way, right? When you tell it to act like a certain kind of person. So keep that in mind. Constraints, this is real has been really big for me when experimenting with qualitative analysis. These are the rules, boundaries, or limitations that you want the AI to follow as it's giving you its output. And I'll show you an example of like a constraint that I give it, almost any time I'm doing qualitative analysis with AI. And then format is just any information that you can tell it about how you want the data presented. So it's a little bit easier to see this in the context of like an example, right? This is one long prompt. We're mostly going to have conversations where we sort of go back and forth with the AI with bits and pieces. But if you want to see how all of these pieces would fit together in one long prompt, here's an example where you can see how I'm talking about context, how I'm talking about persona, what task I'm giving it. The constraint is really what I wanted to show you. Emily and I both, in the examples that we've messed around with, have really emphasized to the model not to invent information. We tell it explicitly. We don't like take it for granted that it's not going to just come up with stuff. We ask it not to invent information and to include direct quotes only, because I will tell you this from personal experience. It will come up with some quotes that sound amazing. They illustrate your point perfectly, and nobody ever said it. So like that's something that I always do now that I realize. I mean, the first time I ever tried this, I realized it'll just make stuff up that sounds incredible. So I always constrain it by telling it include direct quotes only. And then just a few other useful AI prompting habits for qualitative work that that Emily and I have kind of developed over the course of experimenting for this workshop. Prompt in stages. So I've found that instead of, I used to think of prompting as like writing out this long prompt that includes all of these ingredients that's going to give me the output on like the first shot that I want, right? But I've found as the AI models have changed, it's like partly because the way the models are designed have changed, but also just partly I'm getting better at interacting with the models. That if you approach it more like a conversation rather than like I'm going to give you something to do and you give me what I told you to do. Like instead of just like a straight up like call and response, if you approach it more like a conversation, you get more useful output. And so the examples that we give are all structured like a conversation. You'll see us kind of having that conversation bit by bit. Force it to stay close to the text, give it constraints. Something that it's really good at, and Emily can speak to this a little bit too, I think, is it's really good at giving you maybe counter examples or finding places where your perspective has missed something. It's good at checking. Not only does it have its own bias, it's good at checking for your bias also. So you can use it in that way. And then also interrogating the responses. So I never take the response from AI, just like I never take the response from a human co-researcher at face value. Like I'm always interrogating, not in like a combative way, but like always interrogating, can you explain to me how you came to that conclusion? Or what assumptions are you making when you suggest these solutions? Emily, any other points that you'd like to bring up that you've noticed as you're prompting with these chatbots?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, with any, as with any AI tool, you really want to try to play around with it to see, until you can kind of get it to a place where you trust it. Just even in my own example, and I'll share a little bit more. I ran it several different ways through Gemini and came up with extremely different outputs, and didn't really, change a whole lot other than maybe constraints or the way that I framed it. But yeah, so just continue to, especially in the context of qualitative analysis. Um, you know because so much of it is reliant upon the subjectivity and meaning making of the individual, the researcher. You really want to just kind of play around with it until it starts to maybe follow a track that it. I don't want to say that it duplicates what you're thinking, but where you guys are you're more in line with one another. Yeah.
It converges.
Right, convergent. That was
Yes.
the word I was looking for.
And we had an excellent question or note in the chat about limiting sources that I think also fits really well here because it is like a prompting strategy. And it all boils down to, I think the question, correct me if I'm wrong, is like, how do you think about limiting the chatbot sources or memory so that it kind of only knows what's most useful to doing this qualitative analysis with you. So yes, you can use Copilot notebooks, Notebook LM to limit the information that the chatbot has access to like, for example, just your focus group transcripts or just your interview transcripts, so that it's not like pulling from like mine when I did this, it was like pulling from its large corpora of data to come up with like fancy sounding quotes that just didn't exist, right? So this would help you sort of limit that problem. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning is like, when do I start a new conversation? So whenever you start a new conversation in ChatGPT, Gemini, any of these tools, it doesn't fully reset its memory, but it kind of clears its memory of all of the stuff that you've been previously talking about in your older conversations, right? Not totally, it'll retain some traces of memory, but it gives you a clean slate more or less. So one strategy that you can use is like, for example, if you don't want to have it memories from like one interview influence the way it interprets the next interview that you're going to feed it. You could open those up in different conversations, right? So like run those interviews through different chat dialogues instead of in one dialogue processing one after the other. Because if you process one after the other, everything that it's seen before is going to influence how it processes later interviews. So the Copilot notebooks and Notebook LM, I think that's a little bit more technical. It sounds like maybe Akash is like more familiar with using these tools for qualitative analysis or analysis in general. But on a very like a more basic level, just knowing when or remembering that when you start a new conversation, like that's when it sort of wipes its memory relatively clean. And when you're in the same conversation presenting additional data, it's using everything that you talked about before to give you its next response. And Akash, feel free to put in if you have additional thoughts on this, please feel free to leave them there, or come off mute when we all start talking together and share those, because that's a really important point. Is that this thing has memory, and the memory is a source of bias for it. Okay, so the last thing before we hop into the examples, we thought it was really important to there's no way to do justice to all of these ethical conundrums that arise when you start using these AI tools, but we wanted to foreground them for you, right? So the ethical kind of considerations that Emily and I have come up with fall into these four kind of buckets. So the first is privacy, and Emily has already talked about this, I think, really eloquently. I'm just being mindful that the data that you put in, a good rule of thumb, I love that rule of thumb. Anything that you wouldn't send in an email, don't feed it to the chat bot, and prioritize enterprise tools that don't use that data for training purposes if your organization has access to them. Overtrust. This was a big one for me. I don't know. I'm like probably one of those people that would like accidentally join an AI cult or something because like my AI is so good at knowing how to talk to me at this point. But remember, like this thing is like trained on just a huge volume of like text and social interactions on the internet. And so it speaks really convincingly, but it misses nuance and it overstates its certainty constantly. So you have to really interrogate your AI, the AI's responses. That's kind of like my way of mitigating this ethical conundrum. Bias. Remember, AI's responses reflect biases in the training data. Again, I think the best way to overcome this is to interrogate the AI's responses and do what Emily was discussing earlier, which is like, wait for keep talking to it or keep having different conversations until something converges with your own experiences, what you know about your community, what you know about the data, right? And none of this is a replacement for looking at the data yourself, reading the responses yourself, and like viewing the AI's responses through the lens of knowing, hey, this thing is biased in like so many different ways, and like, and can I see any of that here that I need to interrogate? And then, of course, AI technology, data centers have massive, like so many things in the world have massive social and environmental impacts, especially for the global south. And so I think that it's important to not just use these AI tools, for myself, and I know for Emily too, not just using them willy-nilly. Like we know when we will and won't use AI, like when the benefit like when we can get real practical benefit from using these tools, not just to like generate a funny image or something like that, which can be fun or whatever. But like you have to come up with your own personal ethic, of when you want to use these tools and when it's worth it to you. And then also just being aware that these tools, because they do have such huge social and environmental impacts, I think it's important if you use them on a regular basis to stay aware and advocating for anti-extractivist policies that mitigate the harm that these tools can cause in various regions of the world, but especially the global south. Anything you want to add here, Emily?
Yeah, I would just say that, just kind of touching on bias a little bit, just kind of keeping in mind that at some point AI is trained by humans, right? And we all come with our own biases, right? So, and there's been tons of studies that have been done that really kind of highlight some of the racial, socioeconomic biases that come out in a lot of the results or in the data. And so, biases can sometimes be hard to catch, especially if your experience is similar to the dominant experience, right? So really, I think in terms of the of trying to mitigate bias, I think it one thing that I find really helpful is to try to think to really kind of critically think about the position's experiences information and knowledge that comes from people who are not part of the dominant group, right? Because those are usually the ones that are either within the context of AI can be reduced to stereotypes or that can be left out completely, right? So kind of, I guess all that to say is to really just kind of be critical about the information and really kind of thinking critically about who is included and who's not when you're doing this, especially when you're doing qualitative work, right? Which tends to want to get to the root of some of those personal experiences and those subjective data points that that we're trying to tease out.
You can, I think, Emily, you
Oh,
can take
sorry,
it
yeah.
from here. Yeah.
Yeah. So just kind I really want to reiterate the point I think Autumn's made beautifully throughout the presentation is that it does help in simplifying qualitative work, but the researcher's always in the driver's seat, right? And I think that you just even recently, at work we had I had a situation where I really kind of had to think about that, and I was like, well, is this tool that we're trying to develop like trying to put me out of a job, right? And then just really kind of thinking through like what that means to still be in control of the research process, right? And so part of how I take that is that meaning making does still lie in the hands of the researcher, right? Not AI. And you should be in control of that, regardless of whether you're using an inductive or a deductive approach or both. You are the one who is making doing analysis, doing assessments. You're the one who really understands what the stakes are of the project that you're undertaking, what it is that you're trying to find out of that. So you're the one who's going to make sense of the meaning. AI is going to give you, kind of like the output, right, as it relates to the tasks and the prompts that you've given it. But you're the one who needs to really kind of be in control of what that means for your organization and for your project. Um, and so, while qualitative analysis requires human processes, AI can serve as a thought process partner in this process. And so when I think about thought partners, one of the ways that I use AI, so when I do qualitative work, I use a qualitative software. I'll usually use MaxQDA or um, Atlas TI. And Atlas TI has a built-in, they've been really kind of building up, buffing up their AI tool. And so one of the ways that I'll use AI in that setting is especially if I'm doing work where I'm coding or I'm doing analysis on my own and don't have the benefit of a secondary partner to kind of establish an intercoder reliability. I'll do my work, I'll do the coding and I'll, do the analyses and then I'll run it through the AI and see like what AI thinks about the findings, what it felt was important, right? And this is really helpful for me because it lets me check my own biases, right? Because as a researcher, we come into research projects oftentimes with our own uh, assumptions about what we're going to find or frameworks that we tend to favor over others. And so this helps me kind of curb that, but it also allows me to pick up things that maybe I didn't code at all that are a relevant strand, right? In terms of getting to that bigger research question that I was asking. So, yeah, so you can use it just the same way that you can use it in software. You can kind of create your prompts to do the same thing for you if you're using, a free tool. And it again, it doesn't replace the researcher, but again, I just really want to emphasize that it is a tool. And for those of you who have done qualitative work, there are portions of it that can be really mundane and that can be really time consuming. And so, even in terms of like thinking about creating transcripts off of interviews or, cleaning transcripts, which if anybody's had to do that knows that it's probably one of the worst parts of qualitative analysis. But Zoom has really great AI tools that allow you to produce a much cleaner and robust transcript of an interview or a focus group if you host those online than we've had in the past. So just really kind of thinking about like how is it that I can use AI to make my time make more efficient use of my time and to kind of cut down or streamline those tasks that don't necessarily get me to an analysis or get me to an answer, but have to be done in the interim in order for me to get to the point where I can start doing that analysis and getting my output.
So now let's play. All of that in mind, I feel like we have to give so many disclaimers because this is like such a complex and like nuanced topic. But now keep all of that in your brain and let's play and like see how it actually happens when you're having these conversations. So in all of our examples, we're going to think about how AI can fit into your qualitative analysis process in three kind of different phases. So this process owes a great debt to this citation down here at the bottom, and we've got a link to that citation in the box folder that Allison shared with you all too. So definitely check that out if you are interested in like a qualitative analysis framework that's kind of been developed with working with AI in mind. But we're going to think about how AI can help us get to know our data, ask questions of our data, and synthesize insights from those questions. I've grayed out developing questions here because I think Emily and I kind of agree that that's like a really human sort of part of the process, thinking about like, what do I actually need to know from this data? What can I learn from this data? We sort of think about as something that humans are doing. Okay. So does everybody, I'm going to take a second to pause here. Um, Put in the chat if you're having any trouble accessing a chatbot, whether that's Gemini, Copilot, Claude, ChatGPT, whatever you're using. I want to make sure that if you're planning on working through examples with us, you've got a chatbot pulled up and that you have access to specifically. So if you go to, let's see. So if you go to the box link that Allison sent, there's a Gen AI and Qual packet. So in that packet, I have put together all of the prompts and all of the like example materials in one place. So if you just want to like copy and paste these things into your own chatbot, you can do that easily instead of finding your own examples or writing your own prompts. You can sort of start these interactions by just copy and pasting what we used to start these interactions. So if anyone's having any trouble accessing any of that, the packet or just a chatbot, um, put go ahead and put that in the chat and we'll do our best to troubleshoot with you as we're going through the examples. Okay, so our first example is going to be with survey responses. Here I have in the packet, starting on page 2, I have survey example data where I literally used ChatGPT to help me come up with these too, if you need a better example of how good it is at coming up with stuff. So this is all fabricated data edited by me to make it work better for this, example context. So all of these are like fake responses to this question about additional feedback about experiences at a resource fair. What worked well? What challenges did you experience? And what would you like to see improved? So using that example data, I'm starting with this first part, this getting to know your data. So this is a place where like you'll see that my approach and Emily's approach differ for kind of various reasons. Emily is very used to going in, looking at the data and getting to know it like I call it like totally manually, like just Emily, her brain, her experiences, and the data. I'm showing an example of like, you're going to do that. You're going to go in, you're going to read your data yourself. But if you want to use the AI to like start brainstorming with you, what do I have here? This is how you would do it, right? And this is probably something that I'm more likely to do than Emily, for better sometimes, maybe for worse sometimes others, right? But here, so the prompt that I use to sort of get to know this data is it's here on the screen. It's also in the example packet if you want to copy and paste that into your chatbot. But I asked it to analyze the provided qualitative data or these free response questions. Identify and list a certain number between 2 and 10 recurring themes. Each theme should be distinct and not overlap with the others. And when you identify each theme, give me a concise descriptive title for the theme and then a detailed description of the theme. And so I did this in ChatGPT. And you can see in the PDF, I think it should link you to like a saved copy of these actual conversations that I had with the AI. So you can see I just copy and pasted that prompt in, and then I said, here are the responses. And I just copy and pasted all of those responses in. And here's what it gave me. It gave me one, two, three, four, five, six themes. It decided on six themes. Logistical and accessibility barriers, difficulty navigating the events and services, welcoming and empathetic staff interactions, so on and so forth. So Emily and I want to give you all 5 minutes here to do this yourself. So you can paste in the prompt yourself in your tool of choice. You can paste in our data, our fake data, or you can paste in some de-identified data of your own if you would like, if you're comfortable with doing that. And then after those 5 minutes, so we'll come back together around like 9:57. We'll keep an eye on the chat in the meantime. And we're going to have a conversation about how that went. How did you feel about the themes that it extracted? Did it feel right to you compared to what you read in the survey data? Did it feel wrong? What kind of follow-up questions are you asking it? We just want to hear how it goes for you all. So I'm going to be quiet except to answer questions now until 9:58. We'll come back together and we'll talk through how it's going. Somebody did mention that they're having difficulty accessing the folders, so I'm just gonna drop the PDF straight into the chat, so you don't have to access the folder if it's giving you trouble. So I just dropped the PDF for the packet that's got those prompts and the examples in there. And then I'll drop the PDF of the slides also if you happen to be having trouble but want to have the slides on your own computer. And then Emily responded to a question about what part of the documents we're adding to be analyzed right now. It's just what's on page 2 in the generative AI qualitative packet. So there's like a page of fake free response survey questions. And then we've got some super interesting. I'm loving seeing people recording what kind of themes they pulled out using the exact same data, but in different softwares.
No, I think she actually used the same software, which was I found really interesting. I think.
Oh, I see that now. Okay, we got also somebody using Perplexity. That's another one I didn't mention, Perplexity. It's a chatbot like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. I don't use it as much, but it works very similarly. And some people do really like it. I know people who use it kind of as their main one. Okay, perfect. And Anuja, thank you for putting in the themes, copying in the themes. This is super interesting to see yours compared to mine. Yeah, I guess we can go ahead and start off the discussion now. Feel free to keep playing around as we're talking, and putting those experiences, thoughts, or kind of like takeaways in the chat. I'm seeing when I'm looking at like themes that you all are getting compared to mine, it seems like they're sort of clustering or like converging around very similar themes, but the way that they emphasize them or break them down or like the level of specificity that they're using to describe each of those themes is like slightly different across each of our responses, which I think is interesting. And I mean, it is nice that they're converging. This is a pretty simple data set. I kept it from having a lot of contradictory kind of responses, which of course can happen in real life. But it is nice to see that it's converging. I do think it's interesting to note, though, the way that it's framing things differently for each of us, because that could influence the way that then, you go on to frame things for your memos or like when you're developing solutions, right? So just staying aware that the way it's framing things is influencing you. What are you thinking, Emily?
I was just thinking how this is not unsimilar to when you have multiple folks working on a project together to code and analyze, right? And part of that process when you start is, or at least the way that I do a lot of my projects is that we each take a document and we all do an initial coding, initial analysis, and then we come back to see where we converge and diverge. And oftentimes you'll see exactly the same thing, right? So I think it's really interesting to see that playing out with AI tools as well. And again, that also is where I was kind of saying like that's helpful in terms of allowing you to maybe see things that you had missed. Maybe like if I would have run something like this after I had done my initial coding, I could say, oh, well, I didn't really think about this theme, or I didn't, I didn't, or I um, I melted this theme into another theme, and they actually could be two standalone themes for these reasons, right? So you can kind of see some of those nuances playing out.
I think we got two questions that I want to briefly respond to as well before we move on to the next part of this example. So the first is about if you do this, how do you cite it? I love that we're bringing that up early. Emily has some more detail to talk about later in terms of documenting your use of AI, but I just want to raise that as an important aspect of this. I think that where you can get into trouble is when you don't talk about having used it, right? I think it's really important to be transparent about the use of AI in, for example, developing qualitative memos or something like that. So Emily's going to talk about the kinds of documentation that we try to keep track of in order to like keep a paper trail of our own AI use. But if you use AI to develop a memo, for example, I take a kind of informal approach, but I do always cite that I used it, where I might put like a message at the bottom of the memo to say like, the qualitative analysis for this memo was done in collaboration with AI. For more details, either like reach out to me or like I might link to a separate document or something like that. I think that that's kind of, for me, a good balance of being open about the way that I used it, but also like not overwhelming people with the details of how I used it. So I didn't talk about this earlier, but I do think if you're doing an actual research project, that it's worth considering whether or not you include your potential use of AI in the consent process. This is something that we haven't thought about or talked about a ton in like at Kinder, but I think it's something that we're going to need to start talking about more is like what do participants need to know about the way that you use AI? So I don't have any good answers for you about that, but I want to put it on your radar as like, this may be something that your organization has to think about in the future. And then
And
the
then
other
on top
thing,
of,
go
I
ahead,
was just going
Emily.
to add to that, on top of, I second all of Autumn's suggestions. Also, if you are doing this for publication, or you are, following a specific style, almost every format style out there now has its own version of how they want you to document AI. So if you're an APA user, MLA, look to see what your style guide tells you is the appropriate way for you to document AI use. I think that's outside of what Autumn is saying about putting that disclaimer for transparency's sake at the beginning, but also, making sure that you're citing it as a source within the context of your work cited.
And then the last thing I want to comment here is this like really great conversation between Anuja and Alicia that we've got in the comment here. Do you think it remembered my pattern of data analysis and content creation and used it to give an output for this question? Yes, it almost certainly did. The question is like, what about your pattern of data analysis and content creation did it remember? Some of these tools give you a way to check which memories it used to give a response. So, like, for example, mine will often say, I remember that you're an education researcher and, blah, 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 and that you're really focused on data communication. So you can check that on most of these tools. And then Alicia's point is a really good idea too. If you are just playing around or you're having a conversation that you don't want it to use to influence later conversations, you can tell it first off, I'm just messing around. Don't use this, don't use this to influence the way that you have other conversations with me. Okay. So if you have continuing thoughts, questions, feel free to keep popping them in there. I'm going to move on to the next part of this example. Okay. Let's see. So we already kind of talked about this, but this developing the questions part, the questions that you ask the data in the next part, I think are like uniquely suited for you as the human to come up with. So the way that I kind of went about this process is I looked at the themes that it came up with, and I was like, okay, so if this is what's in my data, what are like actionable questions? Like my bent is usually towards like what's actionable here? What can we do something about? Like what can we learn about that we can do something about? Um, and so based on those themes, I came up with like this actionable question that I wanted AI to help me think through about my data. So this theme, difficulty navigating the event and services, I was like, okay, we can do something about that. What about the event made it difficult to navigate? So here you can see where I asked it that question. Just going back to that conversation. So after the themes, I asked it, what about the event made it difficult for participants to navigate? Several aspects of the event appear to have contributed to navigation difficulties, both physically and informationally. And then it tells me it's going to give me five main sources of confusion or friction, and it maps out those five things and then tries to summarize them for me down here at the end. So this is what I got when I asked it. I would consider that a qualitative research question that I got with bottom up. Like my process was bottom up. I started with the data. What can I learn? What kind of actionable questions can I ask of the data? And then I asked the AI that question. What about the event made it difficult for participants to navigate? So now I'm going to give you all some time to ask questions of the data. So in that same, I would suggest in that same conversation, right? Because it's going to remember, it's going to have in its memory all of those survey responses and the themes that it identified. So you can ask it the same question that I did. What about this event made it difficult for participants to navigate? Or you could ask it your own question. So like some others that you could ask it are like what are, let's see, you could ask it, you could ask it about programming, right? Like how are participants responding to our programming? You could ask it about like strengths. Like what are the strengths that people are identifying that we could build on? The question that you ask it is totally up to you, but I'm going to give you 5 more minutes to kind of play around here with questions. So you can keep putting, your thoughts, what's going on when you're having these conversations in the chat, and we'll kind of keep talking through them as we see them, and then we'll move on around 10:13. Okay, so we've got Anuja in the chat. What do participants want to see more of? Is the question that they asked. I like that. It's from a we're going to talk a little bit when we talk about focus groups about how the questions that you ask can come from like filtered through different lenses. And I think that's like a program improvement. You all are way more than me, like experts on quality improvement and program improvement. But to me, that feels like a question through that lens, which I really like that. What difficulties did they encounter? Ooh, and Tempest also included list and rank with frequency mentioned, which I like. So that's an additional, so that would be like a something about the format that Tempest is telling the AI to give them. So they want to know like, okay, not just like that's a good way to check its assumptions. That I like that as a way to check its assumptions because you're like, okay, show me the actual evidence of how often these were mentioned. That's really nice.
And it's really in line with for those of you who have done qualitative work before, the way that you check your codes to see the relevance of the codes. How often is that mentioned within, your data analysis? Like, is it really as much of a theme or a concern as I initially thought it was, right? So, yeah, I really really appreciate that caveat being placed on it.
And I think this does similar work as my like use direct quotes only. I mean, it's asking for a different thing, but the sort of like the goal behind it is the same. It's like show me your work. Okay. All right. Sorry, I was looking ahead to what I wanted to cover before I pop it back over to Emily. Okay, so I won't belabor the point here. You can ask it all kinds of questions, and it just will kind of like expound on the it'll sort of expound on those themes, basically. The way that I set it up is like it digs into those themes based on the questions that I asked it. Here, I just want to point out that it can be really helpful to reread the original responses, right? So like re-immerse yourself in the actual things that people were saying so that you can keep that top of mind with how the AI is interpreting everything. And then the last sort of piece of this conversation is on synthesizing insights. So this is something that I think that I would do that maybe that again Emily might would do with like Emily and Emily's own brain and the data. And here I'm asking the AI to sort of do it with me. So keep in mind, this is also like traditionally a very labor intensive, like person oriented step of the process that I'm just kind of experimenting, playing around with like, how can AI help me do this? So writing memos is like an important part of synthesizing insights from qualitative research. And this is the prompt that I used to see what it could do when I asked it to write me a memo. So I asked it for this data to write me a memo synthesizing these insights, include relevant quotes, include potential solutions, only use direct quotes, do not fabricate any information from the survey responses. Um, and you can see, I'll just show you so that we can talk briefly about the focus group example. I'll just kind of show you what it did. It gave me this like overview of feedback. I wanted it to give me a memo. I will point out that what I actually, when I was writing this, wanted was a memo just on accessibility and logistical barriers, because that's what the theme I had been wanting it to explore. But I wanted to show you that with the way that I wrote the prompt, leaving it open-ended, I just told it to write me a memo, and it did. And it wrote me a memo on all of the themes that it identified, which was not what I wanted, right? But it is technically what I asked for. So that's just kind of an example of how its brain works. It sort of takes what you ask at face value, right? So you do have to be very specific. And if I was doing this really instead of just as an example, I'd be like, no, I want the memo just on the learnings about accessibility and barriers. So you can try this on your own. You can ask it to write a memo and see if what does it come up with? Does it feel helpful? Is this something that you could actually use? Um, I would encourage you to do that. But in the interest of leaving like the last bit of time for Emily to talk about document analysis and documenting your work, I just want to briefly move on to how we thought about this same process, but with a very different kind of data. So in this case, a focus group transcript. So the focus group transcript that we used, again, this was created with AI. Um, that example transcript starts on page 4 of the packet. You can read through this if you want to later, just to like compare and contrast what the AI sees versus what you see. But it's pages 4 through 6 in the agenda packet. So here in this example, I did a very similar thing. I started by asking it to identify recurring themes. I won't show you that because it worked very similarly to how I did it with the survey data. And then from those themes, I developed questions, just like with the survey data. Again, the perspective that you bring is going to really influence how the AI answers those questions, right? So I came up with like similar questions from like different perspectives, right? So if what I was interested in was improving the program, I might ask a question about I might phrase the question, what barriers do participants experience? If I was really interested in like putting an equity lens on this data and these findings, I might say, what perspectives dominate discussions of success within the program? Like, what does success look like for our participants, right? And does that look different for different participants depending on their background and so on and so forth? And then if I want to look at this from like a donor messaging perspective, I might ask something like, how do participants describe the ripple effects of the program beyond employment? Again, you can look at the example conversation that I had with this data set here. And I asked it each of these different questions, and you can see how it kind of responded in the examples if you want to look through that later. But the process is the same. I asked for themes, and then I had my own ideas about questions that came out of those themes that I then asked it in that same conversation. Again, nothing is going to be a replacement for going through and rereading, re-looking at the actual data. And again, I say this is like I'm preaching to myself here because it's very convincing. I mean, you can read what it told me. Like it's pretty eloquent in far as coming up with like connecting things together and sort of inferring stuff. And some of the stuff it infers is justified, and some of the stuff that it infers is not justified. So here's where it can be really helpful to reread that original transcript. And then I did the same thing to get a memo, like something that I could actually use to explain my findings to other people or to support me in explaining my findings to other people. I asked it to write a memo synthesizing insights. I was more specific this time on barriers to enrolling or participating in the program. And then I gave it all of those constraints. So I'll just show you before I hand it off to Emily. This is what it gave me this time. It was more specific, right? It had a little bit more nuance because it was zoomed in on a particular question instead of the interviews or the focus group as an entire whole. And it makes leaps, right? Like a recurring insight across the discussion was that even relatively small logistical obstacles could become significant because participants are already managing substantial stress and instability. Maybe that's not like a leap, that's like a connection, but it made it. I didn't make it. So you want to check these connections and be, like, is that a justified connection to make? And I did go back and check in, like, in my pretend transcript, that is, I think, a justified connection to make, but it's going to make these for you, right? And then it broke down each of the different barriers and potential. I asked it to give me potential solutions. So it brainstormed potential solutions for me, that I could then present as well. Okay, so I am going to pass it off to Emily to talk about how you can run through the same process, but with documents, because we know that you all, have probably have a lot of documents at your disposal that just nobody has the time to go through and pull insights out from. So Emily's going to talk through how we do that and how you could think about doing that.
Thank you. All right. So, for this ex assignment or exercise, the example that I used was and this is all public information, so it's absolutely available for you to download on your own if you wanted to. So I'll just share it. I used a meeting minutes, or a board meeting agenda packet from Aldine ISD. Um, the whole agenda was like close to 200 pages. So I just pulled out a section of it that specifically dealt with like some of the findings around bilingual and ESL programs, right? Just it was more of a wrap up for the board about what, like, just kind of their findings, their recommendations, whatever, right? And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to think about this in terms of um, thinking about this as part of a larger, maybe research project where I'm assessing multiple forms of data, multiple documents to really kind of get a holistic picture about what um, what bilingual and ESL programs look like for this district, and and how have students benefited or succeeded in these programs, right? And so I kind of treated the board meeting agenda that I just shared with you all in the chat as one source of one document and a theoretical slew of documents that I would be analyzing to kind of get the bigger picture. And so for me, I used Chat GPT, and I really one of the things that I wanted to kind of walk through, and we can share both of these examples if you don't mind clicking, Autumn.
Oh, yeah, I can do that.
Um, And I just realized like I can share the output example. So a couple of things. So with Gemini, you can do two really different, you can use it in two different ways. You can create gems. So if you're, for example, working on a research project that you're probably going to keep using AI for, you can create a gem that really kind of sets the context and the environment for that particular project. And what it'll do is it'll save the gem, and then the next time you go in, you can pull up the gem and ask it. You have new conversations each time, but in general, it will already have the context of what this project is and why you're asking it specific questions, right? So you can create the gem. This is my output from the gem, and I ask specifically those questions that were on the slide, that were again the one about what is the data telling us about ESL and bilingual programs, and how are students benefiting, or how have these programs benefited students or led to student success, right? And so an interesting thing is that the output when I use the gem is far larger than the file itself. So it's like a 16 page but it did, to an extent, do what I asked it to do. I wanted it to give me themes. I used specifically the prompts that Autumn shared around what the constraints were, how many themes to develop, and it did give me that, right? Like it gave me these critical themes that were recurring in the data. Um, and so from that, I could I could kind of synthesize that with the findings that I have across other documents. The other really cool thing about the way that this works is that if I were in the process of doing this using multiple documents, I could create the gem and upload multiple documents for it to look across documents to really kind of give me output, right? So it'll synthesize across those so long as I put those constraints as to what it is that I'm looking for. And I think Autumn also she did a ChatGPT version, and we just kind of wanted to have two different examples to show the differences in what the output looks like or what the findings look like.
Sure. Yeah, they look totally different. I won't belabor this point for the purposes of, oh, something went wrong. I won't belabor this point for the purposes of time. However, they do look totally different. So I don't have all of these like nice tables like Emily has for one thing. So the choice of tool does really heavily influence the kind of output that you get.
Yeah. And this is just a screenshot of the next this one is just a screenshot of kind of what the output looks like when so the other option I was mentioning is that you could use Gemini in much the same fashion that you use kind of like a chat GPT where you just putting your parameters, ask it to do a task on the main screen and it'll put the output. This one was a lot more straightforward and it gave me it kind of really cut down a lot of the noise from the background. I was going back and forth through them and I was like thinking if this was a real life scenario, which one would be the most beneficial for me? And I kind of came to the conclusion that this version kind of lets me kind of see at a surface level what it is that I can expect to find. But I felt that even though the output um using the gem was a lot longer than the original document, it really kind of framed things in ways that made connections that I wouldn't necessarily have made just looking at the document itself. So in terms of really trying to create uh, a code book or a framework for analysis, or even writing a memo to kind of report back on the findings, I felt like that would be a much better tool for me in particular. So really kind of thinking about even within some of these different models, thinking about what is it that you want to get out of it, and if there's different iterations that you can use within a model, like what will work, what will give you the output that's going to be the most beneficial for your use. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is just documenting the process. So in qualitative analysis in general, I always create a memo template for any project or document that I'm working on. And a normal memo template is going to be something like, kind of writing myself notes about what I discovered through that process, any new codes, any new themes that popped up, questions where like maybe this isn't something that I had thought about in my initial research question, but it's starting to show up multiple times in the data, and it's something that I need to consider, right? So this is a place for me to really document all of that. But in terms of thinking about you know, incorporating AI into that process, I think this is also a great place for you to document the steps that you took in your AI program to obtain the results you're using, right? So if you need to duplicate that, you can duplicate it by being able to see exactly what the steps were that you used, and being able to use that at a later date. Also, as I was saying, key findings, questions that emerged as you analyze, and ultimately. Making sure that you include or record a link to the AI chat record when you're using any thinking model, including a record of its thoughts, right? And this is a really good example from the regular Gemini prompt where it kind of told me like what it was doing and why it was doing it. And I think that in terms of if you're thinking about how you're writing up a method section, for example, like if you're really wanting to think through that and say, well, these were the justifications why we did this, and this, I used AI, and this is how AI thought about that, right? If you're thinking about how you're going to explain those findings a little bit better. Um, yeah, so make sure that you're putting all of that in your memos. It's just a really great place to put all of your stuff in general, and that you can come back to and use for either writing the paper, writing a policy brief, or writing a findings report for your organization, whatever the case may be. You just kind of have it all there for you. Um,
Well, thank you, Emily. That this we do recognize that compared to other workshops where it might be like, hey, here's step A, B, C, D, and E, and then you can get output Z, very reliably. This is a totally different kind of phenomenon that Emily and I have been talking about. So we really appreciate your willingness to like play along with us and talk along with us about all of these different nuances and complexities. We are only the experts in that. Well, Emily is like an actual expert in qualitative analysis, but in terms of like qualitative and AI, we are the experts in that we've been experimenting for a while, maybe longer than you. And so in that sense, like that's the expertise we bring, but we're still learning. And we've also learned a lot from you all today too. So thank you so much for that. It's 10:32, so if you have to hop off, we totally understand. But if you'd like to share one new idea or technique that you're taking with you in the next week, and or any questions that you have, if you want to do that, Emily and I know I can stay on until kind of we've made sure that everybody's had time to get their thoughts talked through and questions answered.
Yes, please join me in giving a virtual round of applause to Autumn and Emily for all the wonderful information. Please make sure you fill out a feedback survey. Please know that all of this information will be shared. So if you didn't get to it or want to play around there, you will be able to get access to all of those goodies to dig in when you might have a more time. But yes, feel free to stick around and ask your questions, but we value you here at Coffee and Quality.
Yes, thank you all. I keep hoping I get invited back because you all are so fun to come talk to.
Oh, thank you.